I didn't expect Caleb to look at me like that. I didn't expect to feel it, either, the heat between us, the tension in every glance, every touch. He wasn't supposed to grow into this confident, self-assured man who could unravel me with a simple word. Ethan. I wanted to push it away, to pretend it wasn't happening. But when he told me how he felt, when his hand brushed mine and lingered, it shattered everything I thought I knew about myself. Now he's gone, and I'm left with the memory of his voice, the weight of his confession, and the line we crossed that I'll never forget. In the conflicted bond, one weekend changes everything, leaving two people tangled in forbidden emotions, and forcing one man to confront the truth he never wanted to face. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The low hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet kitchen as I wiped down the already clean countertop for the third time that afternoon. It wasn't dirty. It hadn't been dirty the first two times either. But my hands needed something to do. Something other than clenching, unclenching, and betraying how nervous I was. The minutes ticked by slower than I wanted them to, and every small sound, the creak of the wood floors, the rustle of leaves against the window, made my chest tighten. It had been 6 years since I'd last seen Caleb. 6 years since the shy, lanky teenager with unruly hair and wide, uncertain eyes had stumbled through my front door on a summer afternoon much like this one. Back then, he'd been all nervous energy, carrying himself like he was always one wrong step away from breaking something or someone. I sighed, tossing the damp dish towel onto the counter and glancing at the clock above the sink. Any minute now. Caleb had texted that morning, letting me know he was on the road. Just a quick visit, he'd said. Catching up. That's all this was. So why did it feel like my stomach was hosting a particularly ambitious circus act? The truth was, Caleb's visit caught me off guard. I hadn't heard much from him in the years since he went off to college. A few sporadic texts here and there, an occasional picture of him hiking or camping with friends, but nothing substantial. Now, out of the blue, he wanted to spend the weekend at my place. I should have been happy, excited even, but instead, I felt off, nervous in a way I couldn't quite place. I busied myself rearranging the small vase of sunflowers on the table, trying to ignore the ache in my chest that nostalgia always brought. Caleb and I had been close once. Closer than anyone else in the family, really. He'd been a quiet kid, always in the background at family gatherings, avoiding his father's gruff bark or his mother's endless chatter. I'd been the one he'd gravitated to, his cool uncle, as he used to call me. The one who let him stay up late watching bad horror movies and eat ice cream straight out of the carton. But time had a way of stretching even the strongest bonds, didn't it? 6 years of silence had left a distance between us, and now I wasn't sure what to expect. The distant rumble of an engine outside broke through my thoughts. My heart lurched. I quickly smoothed down the front of my shirt, brushed invisible crumbs from the table, and took a deep breath. Through the window, I saw a sleek, dark blue car pull into the driveway. Definitely not the beat-up old station wagon his parents used to lend him. The door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, one I barely recognized. Caleb had changed. The first thing I noticed was how he carried himself, shoulders back, head held high, moving with an easy, confident grace that was a far cry from the awkward kid I remembered. His hair, now neatly styled, caught the sunlight, and he was dressed casually but sharply. Fitted jeans, a plain white t-shirt that clung to his frame in all the right ways. My breath caught for a moment, though I quickly pushed the feeling aside. Uncle Ethan. Caleb's voice was deeper than I remembered, but it still held that familiar warmth. He grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat and waved before making his way up the front steps. I opened the door just as he reached it, forcing a smile to mask the strange cocktail of emotions swirling inside me. Caleb? I said, my voice coming out steadier than I expected. Long time. No see. Too long, he replied, stepping forward and pulling me into a firm hug. His arms were strong, surprisingly so, and the smell of his cologne, crisp and clean, lingered in the air as he pulled back. You've grown up, I said, awkwardly, as I stepped aside to let him in. He chuckled, setting his bag down by the door. Yeah, I guess you could say that. But you... He gave me an exaggerated once-over, smirking. You haven't changed a bit. It was a harmless compliment, but something about the way he said it made my cheeks flush. I turned quickly, gesturing toward the kitchen. Come on in. You must be hungry after the drive. Starving, he said, following me. Hope you've still got that famous cooking skill of yours. I've been dreaming about those stuffed peppers you used to make. I chuckled, grateful for the opportunity to steer the conversation toward safer ground. We'll see if I still remember the recipe. Might have gotten a little rusty over the years. As we moved into the kitchen, I caught myself stealing glances at him. Caleb had an ease about him now, the kind of quiet confidence that came with growing into yourself. It was both familiar and foreign, and it made something stir deep in my chest. Nostalgia, I told myself. Just nostalgia. Still, as he settled into a chair at the table, flashing me that easy smile, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that this weekend was going to be anything but ordinary. The kitchen table felt smaller than I remembered, though maybe that was just because Caleb seemed so much larger now. He filled the space with an effortless presence, leaning back in his chair as if he'd lived here his whole life. His long legs stretched out comfortably under the table, and his fingers traced the rim of the glass of water I'd given him, like he had all the time in the world. I set a bowl of stuffed peppers down between us. Yes, I still remembered the recipe, and sat across from him, wiping my hands on a dish towel to mask the slight tremor in my fingers. It was strange seeing him like this, so at ease and so different. You didn't have to go all out, Uncle Ethan, Caleb said, flashing that easy grin of his. You know me, I'd have been happy with pizza or something simple. I shrugged, trying not to let my voice betray the warmth I felt at his compliment. It's no trouble. Besides, it's not every day I get to see you. Figured I'd make something special. His smile softened. Well, thanks. This looks amazing. We both started eating, the clinking of forks against plates filling the quiet. For a moment it felt like old times. Just the two of us, sharing a meal and talking about nothing in particular. But the silence didn't last long. So, Caleb said, looking up at me with a glint of curiosity in his eyes. How've you been, really? You didn't tell me much in your texts. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. What was there to say, really? Life had been fine, quiet, predictable, a little lonely, sure. But that was par for the course when you lived alone and kept mostly to yourself. Same old, I said with a shrug, keeping my tone light. Work's steady. The house hasn't fallen apart yet, and I've still got my little garden out back. Not much to report. Caleb raised an eyebrow, his fork hovering midair. That's it? Come on, Uncle Ethan. There's got to be more to your life than stuffed peppers and gardening. I chuckled, though his words stung a little. Not all of us live exciting lives, Caleb. Some of us are perfectly content with the quiet stuff. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I didn't mean it like that. He paused, his gaze searching mine. I guess I worry about you sometimes. You know, living out here by yourself. Don't you ever feel lonely? The question hit harder than I expected, and I felt a flicker of something close to defensiveness. I'm fine, I said, perhaps a little too quickly. I've got my work, my hobbies. Keeps me busy. Caleb studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable, before leaning back in his chair again. All right, he said quietly, letting it drop. The conversation shifted after that, and I was grateful for it. Caleb started talking about his life, his classes, his friends, the road trips he'd taken over the summer. He spoke with a kind of excitement that was infectious, his hands gesturing as he described hiking through mountain trails or camping under the stars. I found myself smiling, caught up in his stories. He was so different from the Caleb I remembered, so confident, so sure of himself, but there were moments, little glimpses, where I could still see the boy he used to be. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about the things he loved, the way his laughter filled the room, it was familiar, and it tugged at something deep inside me. You've really grown into yourself, I said before I could stop myself. Caleb glanced at me, surprised, before a smile spread across his face. Thanks, he said softly. That means a lot, coming from you. The warmth in his voice caught me off guard, and I quickly looked down at my plate, focusing on cutting another piece of pepper. I wasn't used to this, being the one who felt off balance. Caleb used to be the nervous one, always looking to me for reassurance. Now it felt like the roles had reversed. As the meal went on, I started to notice things. Little things. The way Caleb's smile lingered when he looked at me. The way his voice softened when he said my name. The way his fingers absent-mindedly drummed against the table. A rhythm I somehow found myself watching too closely. I shook the thoughts away as quickly as they came, silently scolding myself for overthinking. He was my nephew, for God's sake. If I felt off-kilter, it was probably just the shock of seeing him again after so long. Hey, Caleb said, pulling me out of my thoughts. Can I ask you something? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Why don't we see each other more often? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes earnest. I mean, I know life gets busy and all, but I miss this. The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I missed it too, I finally admitted, the words feeling heavier than they should have. But you've got your own life now. I didn't want to get in the way. Caleb frowned, shaking his head. You're not in the way, Uncle Ethan. You never were. There was a weight to his words that I couldn't quite place, and the air between us grew heavier. I cleared my throat, forcing a smile. Well, you're here now. That's what matters. He smiled back, though there was something contemplative in his expression as he glanced down at his empty plate. As I started clearing the table, I felt his eyes on me, watching in a way that made my pulse quicken. I kept my head down, focusing on stacking the plates, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling building in my chest. The sound of the TV hummed softly in the background as Caleb and I sat together on the couch, watching a nature documentary he'd picked from the streaming service. A low, soothing voice narrated scenes of predators stalking prey across the savannah, the vibrant colors of the wildlife painting the screen in stunning clarity. But I wasn't paying attention. Not really. My gaze flicked between the television and Caleb, who sat just a little too close for comfort. His legs were stretched out, crossed at the ankles, and his arm rested casually along the back of the couch. He looked completely at ease, his face lit faintly by the glow of the TV. Every so often, he'd glance at me, his lips curving into a small smile, like he knew I wasn't entirely focused on the documentary. "Do you even like this kind of stuff?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. His voice was playful, teasing. "Of course I do," I said a little defensively. He smirked, raising an eyebrow. "Come on, Uncle Ethan. You always fall asleep during these. I remember you'd put one on, say something about learning something new, and then be snoring 10 minutes later." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I don't snore. You do." He leaned closer, his grin widening. Loudly. I rolled my eyes, unable to help the laugh that escaped me. "All right, fine. Maybe I do. But not this time. I'm wide awake." Caleb's gaze lingered on me for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he leaned back into the couch again. I tried to focus on the documentary, but the weight of his presence was impossible to ignore. The couch wasn't small, but somehow it felt smaller with him here. Every time he shifted, every time his arm brushed against mine or his knee bumped me, I felt my chest tighten just a little more. "Do you remember when we went camping?" Caleb asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. "Which time?" I asked, grateful for the distraction. "The first time," he said. "I think I was like 13. You brought me out to that lake. What was it called?" "Lake Ridge." "Lake Ridge," I confirmed with a nod. "That was a good trip. You spent half the time trying to catch a fish with your hands." He laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Hey, I almost got one. It wasn't my fault, they were too fast for me." "No, it wasn't," I said, smiling despite myself. "But you did catch a frog. You were so proud of yourself, carrying it around like it was some kind of treasure." "I still have that picture, you know," Caleb said, turning to look at me. His eyes softened, a flicker of nostalgia passing over his face. "The one you took of me holding the frog. It's on my desk at school." I blinked, surprised. "Really? After all these years?" "Yeah." He shrugged, but there was something vulnerable in the way he said it. "It reminds me of you, of us. That trip meant a lot to me, you know?" The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. A comfortable silence settled between us after that, but the tension beneath it was palpable. Caleb shifted closer, his knee brushing mine again, and this time he didn't move away. I told myself it was nothing, just a casual touch, nothing more. But the heat from his leg felt like it was burning through the fabric of my jeans, and I couldn't focus on anything else. "Uncle Ethan," Caleb said softly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to look at him, and the look in his eyes stopped me cold. It wasn't the teasing, playful gaze he'd given me earlier. This was something else entirely. Something searching, intense. "Yeah?" I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He hesitated, his gaze flicking down to my hands resting on my lap before meeting my eyes again. "You okay?" The question was so simple, but it felt like it carried so much weight. Was I okay? I didn't know. The room felt too small, the air too heavy, and the space between us felt like it was shrinking by the second. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. Caleb didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he shifted slightly, leaning closer, his arm brushing against mine again. This time, it didn't feel accidental. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when things were simpler, when it was just the two of us, and we didn't have to worry about stuff." I frowned, unsure of where he was going with this. "I guess I do sometimes," I admitted. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the TV, his jaw tightening slightly. "No reason. I just miss it, I guess. Miss you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to respond, to say something that would make the moment less charged, but I couldn't find the words. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft narration of the documentary. I could feel Caleb's eyes on me, even though I didn't look at him. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the edge of the couch, grounding myself. When his hand brushed mine on the armrest, I froze. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it lingered just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Sorry?" Caleb murmured, pulling his hand back, but the way he said it didn't sound like an apology. "It's fine," I said quickly, my voice tight. The air felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, couldn't bring myself to move. My thoughts were a tangled mess, my emotions even worse. Eventually, Caleb leaned back, his hand retreating to his lap, and the moment passed. But the tension lingered, heavy and unspoken, as we sat side by side in the dim light of the TV. The grandfather clock in the living room struck midnight, its chime reverberating through the stillness of the house. The documentary had long since ended, leaving the TV screen dark and silent, save for the faint glow of the paused menu. Caleb and I had been sitting in this thick, tense quiet for what felt like hours. Neither of us speaking, but neither of us moving to call it a night. I shifted in my seat, trying to make the room feel less suffocating. "Well," I began, my voice rasping slightly after so long without speaking. "It's getting late. We should probably—" "Uncle Ethan," Caleb interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. I froze. There was something in his tone that sent a ripple of unease, and something else I couldn't quite name through me. Slowly, I turned to look at him, my pulse quickening. Caleb was sitting upright now, no longer slouched back in that relaxed, easy way he'd been earlier. His hands were clasped together tightly in his lap, his knuckles pale from the pressure. His eyes were locked on mine, and there was a raw intensity in them that made my stomach twist. "Caleb," I asked cautiously, "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice steady but quiet. I shifted in my seat, the tension between us suddenly palpable. "All right," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'm listening." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in a way that reminded me of the awkward teenager he used to be. But when he looked at me again, his confidence returned. This whole weekend," he started, his words slow and deliberate. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it, how to explain it, and I know it's probably not what you want to hear, but I can't keep it to myself anymore." My mouth went dry, my grip on the edge of the couch tightened, my knuckles brushing the coarse fabric. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and staring at the floor. "You're going to think I'm crazy, or stupid, or worse, but I don't care. I need to say this." "Caleb," I said, my voice firmer now, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to calm him or myself. "Just tell me what's on your mind." He looked up at me again, and the vulnerability in his eyes was like a punch to the gut. "I care about you, Uncle Ethan, more than I probably should." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like the walls of the room were closing in. My heart was racing, my thoughts spinning so fast I could barely hold on to them. "Caleb," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper, "what are you saying?" "You know what I'm saying," he replied, his tone unwavering. "You felt it too. I know you have." I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it, to push it away, but the words wouldn't come, because somewhere deep down I knew he was right. "This isn't—" I started, but he cut me off. "I've thought about this for so long," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "About you, about us, and I know it's wrong. I know how it sounds, but I can't help it. I feel something for you, Ethan, something I don't feel for anyone else." Hearing him use my name, not Uncle Ethan but just Ethan, felt like crossing a line I hadn't even realized was there. I looked away, my chest tightening painfully. "Caleb, this isn't something we can talk about. It's complicated. It's real," he interrupted, leaning closer. "I know you feel it too. I've seen it. The way you look at me, the way you act when I'm around. You can try to pretend it's not there, but I know it is." I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of the couch so tightly it felt like I might tear the fabric. "You don't know what you're saying," I said, my voice strained. "You're young, Caleb. You're confused. This isn't right." "I'm not a kid anymore," he said firmly. "I know what I'm feeling, and I know what I want." His words sent a wave of panic, and something else I couldn't name, crashing over me. I stood abruptly, putting some much-needed distance between us. "This isn't happening," I said, more to myself than to him. "We can't." "Why not?" he asked, standing as well. His voice was louder now, more forceful. "Why can't we just be honest about this? About how we feel? Because it's not that simple, I snapped, turning to face him. It's not just about feelings, Caleb. There are consequences. There are lines we can't cross. He stared at me, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of our uneven breathing. I'm not asking for anything, he said finally, his voice quieter now but no less intense. I needed you to know. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. I had to tell you how I feel. I closed my eyes, running a hand over my face. My thoughts were a tangled mess, my emotions even worse. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to something that felt so impossible, so overwhelming. When I opened my eyes again, Caleb was watching me, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. Say something, he said softly. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I don't know what to say, I admitted. Just tell me the truth, he said. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. The truth. Did I even know what the truth was anymore? I care about you, I said finally, my voice trembling. More than I probably should. But that doesn't mean that we should act on it. It's too complicated, Caleb. It's not that simple. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. I understand, he said, though his voice was tinged with disappointment. I needed you to know. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but it shifted slightly, taking on a quieter, heavier weight. I sat back down on the couch, running a hand through my hair, and Caleb followed suit, sitting on the far end this time. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in pale golden streaks, bathing the kitchen in an almost dreamlike glow. I stood by the stove, frying eggs in silence, my thoughts a tangled mess. The sizzle of the pan was the only sound, but it barely registered. My mind kept circling back to the night before, to Caleb's confession, to his words that still echoed in my ears. I just needed you to know. I tightened my grip on the spatula, trying to push the memory away. It was too much, too raw to think about. I needed to focus on the now, on the simple, ordinary act of making breakfast. Anything to anchor myself. The soft creak of the wooden floor made me glance over my shoulder. Caleb stood in the doorway, his hair slightly disheveled, his white t-shirt wrinkled from sleep. His eyes met mine briefly before darting away, his usual easy confidence replaced with something quieter. Morning, he said, his voice husky from sleep. Morning, I replied, turning back to the stove. My voice came out stiff, even though I hadn't meant it to. He shuffled into the kitchen and sat at the table, the chair scraping softly against the floor. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence felt heavy, charged, like an unspoken weight pressing down on both of us. I slid the eggs onto 2 plates, added toast to each and brought them to the table. Caleb murmured a quiet thanks, as I set his plate in front of him. But he didn't look up. We ate in silence for a while, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound between us. I could feel Caleb glancing at me occasionally, but I kept my eyes on my food, unsure of what to say or if I even wanted to say anything at all. Did you sleep okay? He asked finally, breaking the silence. I nodded, though it was only half true. I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over. Yeah, he said, but his tone wasn't convincing. I glanced at him then, and the look on his face made my chest tighten. He looked unsure, almost vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to seeing. For all his confidence and maturity, there was still something boyish about him in that moment. Something that reminded me of the Caleb I used to know. I'm sorry if I made things weird last night, he said suddenly, his voice soft. I set my fork down, exhaling slowly. It's not your fault, I said, struggling to find the right words. I wasn't expecting it, that's all. I wasn't planning to say anything, he admitted, his eyes fixed on his plate. But it's been eating at me for so long. I couldn't keep it in anymore. His honesty left me at a loss. Part of me wanted to tell him it was okay, that I understood, but another part of me was still reeling, still trying to make sense of what he'd said, of what it meant for us. We should probably move on from it, I said finally, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Move on? He echoed, his tone unreadable. Yeah, I said, meeting his gaze. You're young, Caleb. You've got your whole life ahead of you. You'll meet people, fall in love, and I don't want to talk about other people, he interrupted, his voice sharper now. I'm talking about you, about us. There is no us, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His expression faltered, and for a moment, I thought I'd finally put an end to it. But then he leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening, and he looked at me with a determination that made my stomach twist. "You're scared," he said simply. "I'm not." I started, but he cut me off. "You are," he said firmly. "You're scared because this doesn't fit into the neat little boxes you've built for your life. But that doesn't mean it's not real." I stared at him, stunned into silence. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. "Caleb," I said finally, my voice quieter now, "this isn't about being scared. It's about doing the right thing." "Who decides what's right?" he asked, his voice softer now but no less intense. I didn't have an answer for that. We fell into silence again, the tension between us thicker than ever. Caleb pushed his plate away and stood, running a hand through his hair. "I'll be outside," he said quietly, heading for the back door before I could respond. I stayed at the table for a long time after he left, staring at the empty plates and trying to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to follow him, to talk things out, but another part of me was afraid. Afraid of what might happen if I let myself get too close. By the time I finally stepped outside, the sun was higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the garden. Caleb was sitting on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees, staring out at the rows of vegetables and flowers I'd been tending for years. I sat down next to him, leaving a careful amount of space between us. For a while, neither of us said anything. The sound of birds chirping filled the silence, a gentle backdrop to the tension still lingering between us. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Caleb said suddenly, his voice quiet. "I know," I said. He turned to look at me then, his expression softer than it had been at breakfast. "Can we at least not let this ruin the time we have left?" I hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, we can do that." His lips twitched into a faint smile, and for the first time that morning, I felt the tension between us ease just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now. The day passed in a haze of small, quiet moments. Caleb and I didn't talk much after breakfast. Instead, we busied ourselves with mundane tasks around the house, each of us silently pretending the weight of the night before wasn't pressing down on us. I spent most of the afternoon pulling weeds from the garden, while Caleb cleaned out the garage. Every so often, I'd catch him watching me from across the yard, his expression unreadable, and I'd quickly look away, pretending I hadn't noticed. Now, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the time for him to leave loomed closer. The car was packed, his bag tucked neatly in the trunk, and the house suddenly felt larger, emptier, as if it was already bracing for his absence. Caleb stood by the open car door, his hands in his pockets as he looked out over the front yard. I leaned against the porch railing, unsure of what to say. The air between us felt heavy, thick with everything we hadn't said. "Well," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I guess this is it." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, guess so." He turned to look at me then, his eyes searching mine. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said. "I know things got complicated, but I'm glad I came." "Me too," I said, the words catching slightly in my throat. And I meant it even if I wasn't sure why. He took a step closer, his hands still buried in his pockets. "I meant everything I said, you know," he said quietly. I stiffened, my grip on the railing tightening. "Caleb, I'm not trying to make this harder," he said quickly, holding up a hand. I didn't want to leave without saying it again. Without letting you know that it's not going to change for me. Not anytime soon." I didn't know how to respond to that. My chest ached, a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle, and I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. "You've got your whole life ahead of you," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "There's so much out there for you, Caleb. So many possibilities." "I know," he said, his gaze steady. "But that doesn't mean I don't know what I want. It doesn't mean I'm confused." I shook my head, looking away. "You'll understand one day, when you've had time to figure things out." "I've had time," he said, his voice firm. "A lot of time, and I'm not going to apologize for how I feel." I glanced back at him, and the look in his eyes nearly undid me. There was no anger there, no frustration, just quiet determination. "I don't want you to apologize," I said softly. "I just want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You make it sound like those two things can't go together." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze and the faint chirping of crickets were the only sounds. Finally, Caleb took a step forward, closing the distance between us. He reached out hesitantly, as if testing the boundary between us, and then he pulled me into a hug. I froze at first, caught off guard by the suddenness of it. But then I felt the warmth of his arms around me, the steady beat of his heart against mine, and something in me softened. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and returned the embrace, my hands gripping his shoulders like I was afraid to let go. The hug lingered, longer than it should have, but neither of us moved to pull away. It felt like he was trying to say something without words, and maybe I was doing the same. When he finally stepped back, his hands lingered on my arms for a moment before falling to his sides. His expression was unreadable, his eyes searching mine one last time. "Take care of yourself, okay?" he said, his voice soft. "You too," I replied, my voice barely audible. He nodded, gave me a faint smile and then turned toward the car. I watched as he climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. He didn't look back, but I stood there long after his car disappeared down the road, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. The house felt impossibly quiet when I finally stepped back inside, the weight of his absence settling over me like a heavy blanket. I sank into the couch, my head in my hands, and let out a shaky breath. It wasn't just the house that felt empty. The house was silent, not the kind of peaceful silence I usually appreciated, but the hollow, oppressive kind that made every creak of the floorboards and tick of the clock feel deafening. The kind of silence that made you realize how empty a place could feel when someone else wasn't there. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The cup rested in my hands, the warmth fading like the sunlight outside, and I stared at the swirls of cream still lingering on the surface. My mind was a jumble, and no matter how much I tried to focus, I kept circling back to Caleb, to his words, to the way he had looked at me before he left. I meant everything I said. I let out a long sigh, setting the cup down and running a hand over my face. The memory of his voice, his conviction, clung to me, refusing to let go. It was impossible to stop replaying it all in my mind. The weight of his confession, the raw honesty in his eyes, and the hug that had lingered far longer than it should have. What was I supposed to do with all of this? With him? I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the living room. The air felt heavy in here, too, the walls bearing witness to all the things that had gone unsaid over the last few days. I sat down on the couch, sinking into the cushions, and let my head fall back against the worn fabric. I closed my eyes, but it didn't help. His face was still there, behind my eyelids, his voice still echoing in my ears. "You're scared." The worst part was he wasn't wrong. I was scared, not just of what he'd said, but of what it meant, of what it said about me. Because no matter how much I tried to push it aside, tried to rationalize it away, I couldn't deny that something in me had stirred when he'd spoken those words. I felt something, and that terrified me. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling. The quiet of the house was oppressive, and the emptiness Caleb had left behind seemed to spread through every corner, seeping into the walls, the floor, the very air I was breathing. I could still smell him faintly, his cologne, clean and crisp, lingering in the fabric of the couch where he'd been sitting just hours ago. How had this happened? How had everything changed so quickly? For years, I'd thought of Caleb as my nephew, my family, the shy, awkward teenager who used to follow me around, asking endless questions and looking up to me in a way that always made me feel a little bigger, a little more important. But now I didn't know what he was to me, or maybe I did. Maybe that was the problem. I stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. My thoughts were a storm, chaotic and unrelenting, and I couldn't seem to make sense of any of it. I thought about the way he'd looked at me last night, the way his voice had softened when he said my name. Not Uncle Ethan, just Ethan. I thought about the way he'd hugged me before he left, the way his arms had lingered, holding me like he was afraid to let go. And maybe I'd held him the same way. "Stop it," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head, but I couldn't stop it. The thoughts kept coming, crashing over me like waves, and with them came a flood of emotions I didn't know how to handle. Guilt, confusion, longing. I sat back down on the couch, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees, my head in my hands. I didn't know what to do with this. Didn't know how to make sense of what I was feeling. Caleb had said he wasn't confused, but I was so goddamn confused I could barely think straight. And yet, beneath all the confusion, there was something else. Something quieter, but no less insistent. I missed him. It was ridiculous. He'd only just left, and yet the thought of him being gone, of not knowing when or if I'd see him again, felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I stood again, walking to the window. The sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, and the sight of it made the ache in my chest worse. He'd be halfway to his apartment by now, driving through the fading light, the road stretching out endlessly ahead of him. Would he come back? I wanted to believe he would. He promised as much, hadn't he? But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us, something that couldn't be undone. I let out a slow breath, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of the window. The house felt too big, too empty without him here. I closed my eyes, my mind drifting back to the way he'd looked at me before he left. The quiet determination in his eyes. The way his voice had softened when he'd said, "Take care of yourself." I didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if we'd ever figure out what this was, or if we even could. But one thing was certain. Caleb had left a mark on me, one that I wasn't sure would ever fade. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to push it all away, part of me didn't want it to. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the room was bathed in shadow. The silence of the house pressed in around me, heavy and unrelenting. But I stayed by the window, watching the last light of the day disappear. Somewhere out there, Caleb was driving toward his future. And I was left here, standing in the quiet aftermath, trying to make sense of everything he'd left behind.